Desperation breeds crazy courage. A skinny 14-year-old kid walked into a smoke-filled biker bar looking for honest work. He expected rejection. He expected ridicule. What he never saw coming was a thunderous roar of 40 Harley-Davidsons shaking his front porch, changing his family's destiny forever. Lowell, Massachusetts, in late November, is a city that forgets how to be warm. The wind howls off the Merrimack River, biting through thin jackets and rattling loose window panes in the cheaper apartment complexes. On the third floor of one of these crumbling brick buildings lived 14-year-old Leo Caldwell and his mother, Sarah. Their apartment smelled of bleach, stale radiator dust, and the sharp, metallic tang of sickness. Sarah had been battling severe renal failure for over 2 years. The dialysis treatments kept her alive, but they were a brutal, exhausting anchor that drained her energy and their bank account. Before the illness, she had worked double shifts at a diner on Middlesex Street, always making sure Leo had warm boots and a hot dinner. Now, she spent her days confined to a faded floral armchair, wrapped in layers of blankets, her skin pale and translucent. Leo was forced to grow up long before his time. He knew exactly which floorboards creaked. He knew how to water down the milk so it lasted until Thursday. He knew the precise tone of voice the landlord used when an eviction notice was imminent. And this week, that tone had turned from annoyed to definitive. They were 3 months behind on rent. The medical debt was a mountain they could not climb, and the state assistants barely covered Sarah's prescriptions. "I'm sorry, Leo," Sarah whispered, one Tuesday evening, her voice trembling as she stared at the pile of final notice envelopes on the chipped Formica kitchen table. "I never wanted you to have to worry about this. I'm trying to figure it out." "Don't worry, Mom," Leo lied, offering her a brave, practiced smile. "I've got a plan." He didn't have a plan. He had spent the last 3 weeks begging for under-the-table work. He had walked miles, knocking on the back doors of grocery stores, auto shops and restaurants. Every manager took one look at his scrawny frame, his oversized thrift store jacket, and his desperate eyes, and shook their heads. "Liability," they said. "Too young," they said. "Come back in a few years, kid." But a few years was a luxury the Caldwells didn't have. They didn't even have a few weeks. The landlord had given them until Friday to come up with $600, or the locks would be changed. By Wednesday afternoon, the cold was biting, and Leo's desperation had morphed into a reckless, quiet panic. He was walking down a grim industrial stretch of marginal roads near the city outskirts when he saw it, the Broken Spoke. It wasn't just a bar, it was a fortress. The exterior was painted matte black, the windows completely boarded up and covered in faded concert flyers. Out front, lined up with military precision, were a dozen gleaming, heavily customized Harley-Davidson motorcycles. This was the undisputed territory of the local Hells Angels chapter. Everyone in Lowell knew you didn't look at the Broken Spoke too long, you didn't park near it, and you certainly didn't walk through its heavy, steel-reinforced front door unless you wore their patch. Leo stood across the street, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He had heard the rumors. He knew the reputation of the men who drank inside. They were dangerous. They operated by their own set of rules. But as Leo looked at the massive, gleaming chrome engines of the bikes, another thought pushed its way to the forefront of his mind. They have money, and bikes need to be cleaned. His mother's coughing fit from that morning echoed in his ears. The image of the eviction notice burned in his mind. Fear was a luxury for people who had a warm bed to sleep in. Leo pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders, took a deep breath that felt like swallowing ice, and crossed the street. The heavy oak door of the Broken Spoke swung open with a slow, ominous groan. The moment Leo stepped over the threshold, the atmosphere hit him like a physical blow. The air was thick, blue with cigarette smoke, and smelled heavily of stale beer, aged leather, and gasoline. Classic rock blared from a jukebox in the corner, but it couldn't entirely drown out the low, rumbling murmur of a dozen deep voices. Every head in the bar turned. The silence that fell was immediate and suffocating. A pool game in the back corner stopped midway through a shot. The bartender, a massive man with a thick beard and a scar running through his left eyebrow, paused with a rag halfway inside a pint glass. Seated at the bar and scattered across the worn booths were men who looked like they were carved from granite and bad intentions. They wore heavy leather cuts, the iconic Death Head logo emblazoned on their backs. Tattoos crawled up their necks and knuckles. Leo stood frozen by the door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He suddenly felt incredibly small, acutely aware of his scuffed sneakers and his shaking hands. "You lost, kid," the bartender growled, his voice like gravel grinding together. Before Leo could answer, a mountain of a man stepped out from the shadows near the pool tables. He stood 6'4", his arms corded with thick muscle and covered in faded ink. A heavy silver chain hung from his jeans, clinking softly as he approached. This was Silas Higgins, known to everyone on the street simply as Crow. "Ain't no candy store here, boy," Crow sneered, stepping into Leo's personal space. He smelled of whiskey and motor oil. "You got about 5 seconds to turn around and walk back out that door before I throw you through it." Leo swallowed hard. His knees felt like water, but he dug his fingernails into his palms to ground himself. I'm looking for a job," he managed to say, his voice cracking slightly before he cleared his throat and tried again, louder. "I need a job." A few of the men chuckled. It was a dark, amused sound. "A job?" Crow laughed, looking back at the bar. "You hear that, John? Kid wants to join the payroll." From a large, circular booth in the darkest corner of the room, a figure leaned forward into the dim yellow light. The bar fell dead silent again. This was John Mackey. He wasn't the biggest man in the room, but he exuded a terrifying, quiet authority. His eyes were cold, assessing, and sharp as flint. He was the president of the chapter, a man who had survived decades of turf wars and prison stints. Mackey took a slow drag from a cigar, exhaled a thick cloud of smoke, and gestured for Crow to step aside. "Bring him here," Mackey ordered quietly. Crow grabbed Leo by the back of his jacket and practically carried him to the booth, depositing him roughly on his feet in front of the club president. Several other high-ranking members, including a wiry man named Tommy Gallagher, leaned in to inspect the intruder. "You got some nerve walking in here, boy," Mackey said, his voice dangerously even. "What makes you think we got work for a kid who looks like a strong breeze would break him in half?" "I'm a hard worker," Leo said, forcing himself to maintain eye contact with Mackey, even as his insides twisted with terror. "I can sweep the floors. I can take out the trash. I can wash the bikes. I know how to polish chrome so it doesn't streak. I'll do it for half of what you'd pay anyone else. I need the money." Mackey studied him for a long, agonizing moment. "Why the desperation, kid? Where's your old man? Why ain't he out busting his knuckles for a paycheck?" The question felt like a punch to the gut. "He's dead," Leo said flatly. "Died when I was 3. It's just me and my mum, and she's sick, really sick. Her kidneys are failing. We're getting evicted on Friday if I don't come up with the rent, and we don't have enough for food. I'll do whatever you need done. Please." Tommy Gallagher shifted uncomfortably in his seat, exchanging a brief, unreadable glance with Crow. But Mackey's expression didn't soften. He took another drag of his cigar. "We ain't the Salvation Army, kid," Mackey said coldly. "We don't hand out charity, and we don't hire children to clean our bikes. It's bad for business." Tears of frustration pricked the corners of Leo's eyes, but he furiously blinked them away. He wouldn't cry in front of them. He had gambled his last shred of hope on this terrible place, and he had lost. "Fine," Leo snapped, a sudden spark of anger briefly overriding his fear. "Sorry to waste your time." He turned to leave, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Hold up." Mackie's voice cracked like a whip, halting Leo in his tracks. "What's your name, boy?" Leo looked over his shoulder. "Leo. Leo Caldwell." The silence in the bar seemed to deepen, stretching tight. Tommy Gallagher's head snapped up, his eyes wide. Crow stopped leaning against the pool table and stood up straight. John Mackie didn't move a muscle, but his eyes narrowed imperceptibly. He stared at Leo for a long time, chewing on the end of his cigar. "Caldwell," Mackie repeated softly, tasting the word. "Where do you live, Leo Caldwell?" 442 Elm Street, apartment 3B, Leo said, confused by the sudden shift in the room's energy. "Get out," Mackie ordered, his voice returning to a hard, dismissive bark. "And don't ever walk into this bar again." Crow immediately grabbed Leo by the collar and marched him to the front door, shoving him out onto the freezing sidewalk. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind him, the deadbolt engaging with a loud clack. Leo stood in the biting wind, shivering violently. He had failed. He walked the 2 miles back to his apartment in a daze, the cold seeping into his bones. When he got home, his mother was asleep in her chair, breathing raggedly. Leo covered her with an extra blanket, went to his small room, and buried his face in his pillow. For the first time since his mother got sick, he cried himself to sleep, knowing that Friday would bring the end of their world. He didn't know that 3 miles away, inside the Broken Spoke, the jukebox had been unplugged, the doors had been locked, and John Mackie had called an emergency meeting at the long wooden table in the back. Thursday was a slow, agonizing crawl toward the executioner's block. The sky over Lowell remained a bruised, heavy, purple, threatening snow that never quite fell. Inside apartment 3B, the radiator clanked uselessly, offering noise but no heat. Leo spent the day packing their meager belongings into cardboard boxes he had salvaged from the alley behind the liquor store. He wrapped his mother's few remaining porcelain figurines in old newspaper, his hands moving mechanically, while his mind raced through 100 failed scenarios. There was no one left to call. No distant relatives, no secret savings account, no sudden miracle waiting in the mail. By the time the sun dipped below the industrial skyline, bathing the apartment in a cold, grey twilight, Leo felt something inside him finally fracture. It was the quiet, devastating realization that he had failed to protect the only person who mattered to him. Sarah watched him from her armchair, her eyes heavy with a mixture of immense love and profound guilt. "Leave the rest, Leo," she rasped, her breathing shallow. "Come sit. We'll go to the city shelter tomorrow. It's not the end of the world, as long as we're together." Leo nodded, though the lump in his throat prevented him from speaking. He sat on the floor beside her chair, resting his head against her arm, listening to the erratic thump of her failing heart. 3 miles away, the atmosphere inside the windowless back room of the Broken Spoke was charged with a different kind of electricity. The heavy oak table was surrounded by the chapter's fully patched members. The air was thick with tension as John Mackie stood at the head of the table, his knuckles resting on the scarred wood. "Caldwell," Mackie said, the name hanging in the stale air like a ghost. He looked around the table, his hard eyes locking onto the older members, the ones who had grey in their beards and old bullet scars under their leathers. "You younger guys don't know the name, but Gallagher knows it. Bobby knows it." Tommy Gallagher, sitting to Mackie's right, slowly took off his sunglasses, revealing eyes that looked suddenly weary. "Arthur," Gallagher muttered reverently. "It's Arthur's kid." Crow, leaning against the cinder-block wall, crossed his massive arms. "Who the hell is Arthur?" Mackie sighed, a rare display of exhaustion from a man who never showed weakness. 12 years ago, before we owned this building, we ran our bikes out of a little independent garage on the south side. The mechanic there was a guy named Arthur Caldwell. He wasn't patched. He wasn't a criminal. He was just a hard-working family man who treated a motorcycle like it was a living, breathing thing. Mackie paused, staring down at the table, his mind dragging him back a decade. We were at war back then, with a syndicate pushing up from Boston. Nasty business. One night they tracked me and Tommy to Arthur's garage. We were unarmed, waiting on a transmission swap. 3 guys walked in with shotguns. They had me dead to rights, execution style. I didn't even have time to reach for a blade. The room was deathly quiet. Even the younger bikers, usually restless and full of bravado, leaned in to listen. Arthur was under a chassis, Mackie continued, his voice dropping an octave. He could have stayed there. He should have stayed there. But he slid out, grabbed a heavy steel torque wrench, and swung it at the shooter. He knocked the barrel away just as the gun went off. Mackie looked up, meeting Crow's eyes. The spread missed me. It caught Arthur square in the chest. He bled out on his own concrete floor, choking on his own blood, while Tommy and I handled the shooters. Arthur gave up his life, leaving behind a young wife and a toddler, so I could stand here today. A heavy, solemn silence blanketed the room. In the world of the Hells Angels, debts of blood and honor were absolute. They transcended time, law, and reason. We gave the widow, Sarah, a massive envelope of cash after the funeral, Gallagher chimed in, his voice rough. Told her to take the boy and get out of the neighborhood for her own safety. We kept our distance, so the syndicate wouldn't connect her to us. We thought she moved out of state. We thought she was set. Instead, she's 3 miles away, dying of kidney failure. Mackie snarled, a sudden, fierce anger radiating from him. And Arthur Caldwell's boy just walked into my bar, shivering in a thrift store coat, begging to scrub toilets because he's getting thrown out on the street tomorrow. Mackie slammed his fist onto the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Get the treasurer, Mackie ordered, his eyes blazing. Empty the safe, and tell every patched member in the city to have their bikes fueled and lined up out front by 7 a.m. Nobody sleeps in tomorrow. Friday morning arrived with the biting chill of a true New England winter. Frost coated the windows of apartment 3B. At exactly 8 a.m., heavy, impatient footsteps echoed down the hallway, followed by 3 sharp, aggressive raps on the door. Leo's stomach plummeted. He walked to the door and unlocked it. Standing in the hallway was Mr. Gable, the property manager. He was a tall, severe man in a cheap trench coat, clutching a clipboard and looking incredibly annoyed. Behind him stood 2 burly men, carrying heavy-duty trash bags. "Time's up, kid," Gable said, pushing past Leo without waiting for an invitation. He looked around the bleak, half-packed living room with profound distaste. "I told you, 8 a.m. sharp. The locksmith is on his way. You and your mother need to vacate the premises immediately." Sarah struggled to sit up in her chair, her breathing labored, panic flashing in her pale eyes. "Mr. Gable, please, just a few more days. It's freezing outside. I'm waiting on a call from the State Assistance Office." "I don't care if you're waiting on a call from the President of the United States," Gable snapped coldly. "You're 3 months in arrears. This is a business, not a charity ward. Boys, start putting their boxes in the hall." Leo felt a surge of blind, protective rage. He stepped between Gable and his mother, grabbing a heavy wooden baseball bat he had left leaning against the radiator. His hands were shaking, but his jaw was set. "Get out," Leo shouted, his voice cracking but loud. "Don't touch our stuff. Just give me until tonight." Gable laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. He gestured to the 2 men. "Grab the bat from the kid and get them out of here." The men took a step forward. Leo raised the bat, terrified but prepared to swing. Then the floorboards began to vibrate. It started as a low, distant hum, like an impending earthquake. Within seconds, the hum escalated into a deafening, guttural roar that rattled the frosted windows and vibrated through the soles of their shoes. It was a mechanical symphony of overwhelming power. Gable frowned, looking toward the window. The two movers froze. The noise was impossible to ignore. It sounded like a fleet of heavy bombers was landing directly on Elm Street. Leo backed up slowly toward the window, the bat still gripped in his hands, and peered through a gap in the blinds. His breath hitched. The entire street below was a sea of black leather and gleaming chrome. 40 Harley-Davidsons were arranged in a staggered, militaristic formation, entirely blocking traffic in both directions. The riders were cutting their engines in unison, creating a sudden, ringing silence that was somehow more intimidating than the roar had been. Neighbors were peering out from behind their curtains, terrified. Pedestrians on the sidewalk had completely vanished. Leo watched in stunned disbelief as John Mackey dismounted his custom road glide. Behind him, Crow, Tommy Gallagher, and a dozen other massive, heavily tattooed men climbed off their bikes. They didn't look up. They simply moved with grim, unified purpose toward the front doors of the apartment building. "What the hell is going on down there?" Gable muttered, suddenly looking very pale. A minute later, the hallway outside apartment 3B filled with the heavy thud of leather boots. The door, which had been left slightly ajar, was kicked open so hard it hit the drywall with a resounding crack. The two burly movers instantly backed away, pressing themselves against the wall. Gable stood frozen in the center of the room. John Mackey stepped into the apartment. He looked larger, more imposing in the cramped space than he had in the bar. Crow and Gallagher flanked him, their expressions murderous. 6 more bikers filled the hallway behind them, completely blocking the exit. Mackey's cold eyes scanned the room, taking in the packed boxes, the baseball bat in Leo's trembling hands, and finally, the frail woman in the armchair. His gaze softened for a fraction of a second before snapping to Gable. "You the landlord?" Mackey asked, his voice low and dangerously calm. I'm the property manager," Gable stammered, all his previous arrogance evaporating. He clutched his clipboard like a shield. "Listen, I don't want any trouble. This is a legal eviction." "Shut up," Crow growled, stepping forward. Gable immediately clamped his mouth shut. Mackey reached inside his leather cut and pulled out a thick, bound stack of $100 bills. He tossed it casually. The heavy stack hit Gable squarely in the chest, forcing him to catch it against his clipboard. "That's $10,000, Mackey said flatly. "That covers their back rent, and it covers their rent for the next 5 years. You don't evict them. You don't send them late notices. In fact, if the heat goes out in this apartment for more than 10 minutes, or if a single light bulb burns out in that hallway, I'm going to send Crow here to have a very personal conversation with you. Do we understand each other?" Gable stared at the stack of cash, his hands shaking violently. He looked at Mackey, then at Crow, who smiled a terrifying, toothy smile. Yes, sir. Absolutely understood." "Then get the hell out of my sight," Mackey ordered. Gable and his 2 men practically tripped over themselves, scrambling out the door, squeezing past the wall of leather-clad bikers in the hallway. Once they were gone, the tension in the room shifted. Mackey took off his leather gloves and walked slowly over to Sarah. He knelt beside her armchair, completely ignoring the grime on the floor. "Sarah," he said softly. Sarah stared at him, bewildered, clutching her blanket. Do I know you?" "You don't," Mackey said, "but I knew Arthur. I knew him very well." Sarah gasped, a tear slipping down her pale cheek. "Arthur, he saved my life, Sarah," Mackey said, his voice thick with uncharacteristic emotion. 12 years ago, he took a bullet meant for me. I wouldn't be breathing if it wasn't for your husband. We thought you moved away. We didn't know you were struggling. If we had known, you would have never gone hungry for a single day." Leo slowly lowered the baseball bat, his mind spinning. The men he had terrified himself to meet yesterday were standing in his living room, treating his mother like royalty. Mackie stood up and turned to Leo. He walked over and firmly clamped a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "You've got your old man's grit, kid. Walking into the Broken Spoke took stones." Mackie looked him dead in the eye. "You asked for a job. You've got one. We run a legitimate custom shop on the east side. You start tomorrow. You'll sweep floors, wash bikes, and learn to turn a wrench the right way. We pay $20 an hour." Leo's eyes widened. "Really? But what about school?" "You stay in school," Mackie said sternly, pointing a finger at him. "You keep your grades up, or Crow kicks your ass. You work weekends and afternoons." Mackie looked back at Sarah. "And we've got a private doctor who handles things for the club. He's the best nephrologist in the state. He'll be here this afternoon to look at your charts. We're going to get you better care, Sarah." Leo dropped the bat. The crushing weight that had been sitting on his chest for 2 years finally lifted. He looked at the terrifying men filling his apartment, seeing past the tattoos and the leather, realizing they had brought him the one thing he had entirely run out of: hope. The roar of engines fading down Elm Street that morning was not a sound of intimidation, but a truly strange, thunderous lullaby. Leo Caldwell, a young boy pushed to the absolute brink, found salvation in the most dangerous men in the city. They didn't simply pay an overdue debt. They fiercely forged a brand new family. Sometimes the darkest shadows hide the fiercest protectors, and angels ride heavy steel motorcycles.